Holy Gospel is told by St. John. Glory to you, O Lord. Then Jesus said to those who believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, we're descendants of Abraham, and we've never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you'll be set free? Jesus answered them, "Very truly I'm telling you, anyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. Now a slave doesn't have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed." This is the gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated, and I invite Mason to come on up, along with my other helper. What? No, not this time, Chris. Just Mason. I need you to stand right here. All right. And I promise you, while you're up here, you don't have to say anything, okay? All right, so there's no worries there, okay? Do you want red or blue? You can sit in the first pew right there. You want red? Okay, cool. We can finish pulling the lids off. All right. So today, it's the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and Mason has no clue what's going on, and that's okay. We're going to pretend that Mason is Martin Luther, okay? So we're going to pretend for a little bit that Mason is Martin Luther, and we're going to kind of tell the story of the Reformation through Martin Luther's eyes. Now, Martin Luther, what he did is he rediscovered the gospel. Gospel is a word that simply means good news. So everyone say with me, gospel is good news. Gospel is good news. All right. Good news. Now, Martin Luther was, like any other child growing up. And like any other child, sometimes he didn't make his bed. And, if he didn't make his bed, or, maybe he forgot to say his prayers before he went to school, and, that left a mark on him as well. And maybe he didn't clean off the dishes off the dinner table. He refused to do that. Or maybe he called his brother Rotten Pickles. So that name you use for your brother, Rotten Pickles. Just most of the time, Martin Luther was a pretty good kid. I mean, like most kids, most of the time, it's not bad forever. But being good didn't make up for the time that he ripped his mother's dress. And being good didn't make up for the time that he kicked the cat either. Now, and being good definitely did not make up for the time that he refused to do his homework. Go for it, Debbie. And in church, Martin here learned that, there's this place called heaven, and heaven's like great, isn't it? Heaven's great? Heaven's great. Okay, see, heaven's great, and Luther realizes that God made heaven for people to go to, but that people who sin, as long as they got sin on them, they can't go to heaven. As long as they got sin covering them, they can't go to heaven, because heaven doesn't have sin in it. And so Martin Luther, if you get the washcloth, Martin Luther would go to confession, and he'd say, well, I messed up. You got the... All right. He'd say, I messed up. I forgot to do my homework. And he'd confess. And the priest say, well, say the Lord's Prayer and you're forgiven. And so he'd get a sin wiped away. And then he'd say, well, I also kicked the cat yesterday. That was kind of mean. And so he'd get another sin wipe away for confessing that. And I didn't do my homework. And so he'd get another sin wiped away for doing that. But then he left confession and he forgot to mention about the time that he, ripped his mother's dress. And he forgot to mention about the time that he wouldn't do the dishes. So those were still there waiting on him. Now, as Martin got older, he realized The sin is much more specific than you think it is. Now, you ever done like bow and arrow? You know bow and arrow archery, right? Okay. So on archery, there's that target that's way over here, right? Okay. Now, the Hebrew word for sin means to miss the mark, so you got the big target here. So if you're shooting your bow and arrow to miss the mark, it's not to miss this. You know, there's all those little circles. There's that really little circle. You miss the really little circle. Even if you get one ring outside of it, that counts as missing the mark. So you have to hit that exact circle. So, for example, let's talk about cleaning the dishes, right? Now, when you're cleaning the dishes, your job is to get them perfectly clean. And so the next day after Martin cleaned the dishes, and they were setting the table, and his brother looked at his dish and said, there's still a little bit of dirt on this dish. And so that counted as sin as well. We can mark him up again. And his mom was putting out the dishes, and she said, these forks still got soap scum on them. And so that counted as missing the mark as well, because those dishes were not perfectly clean. And so Martin Luther realized it's a whole lot harder to not sin than I thought it was, because, every little thing that I do that isn't exactly the mark that I'm going for counts as sin. So let's say that I'm supposed to clean my room, but I left a couple pairs of socks underneath the bed. Well, that counted, yep. Now there's more to go on there. And Martin Luther would keep going to confession. And as he confessed, some of them would get wiped off. He'd miss a few, and so we can wipe a few off here. He'd confess a few, but he wouldn't always get all of them, so some of them would come off and some of them would stay. And Martin Luther started to get scared. He's like, there's this whole heaven place, and if I can't remember all the things I've done and they don't all come off, how am I going to get into heaven? This is getting scary now, because what happens if you don't go to heaven? Oh, yeah, okay. We don't want that, do we? This is getting scary because I can't remember them all. I still got marks on me. And Martin Luther's getting terrified. He's not only getting terrified, he's beginning to get angry. He's beginning to feel like God is the devil. See, God feels like this. Okay, so we got that whole heaven thing. And God's like, there's heaven. It's a great, wonderful place. So God's like, see this great and wonderful place? I'm holding like cookies out in front of you. But I'm not going to let you have them because I'm not forgiving you for everything. So, you can't really I'm just going to dangle them in front of you and make you feel bad about not getting them. You can hammer at the end, okay? That's what God feels like to Martin Luther. He feels like God is teasing him with something really nice out in front of him, but not giving it to him. And then, okay, so then we have that perfection thing. We were watching a movie last week, and in the movie, we saw Martin Luther scrubbing the floor. Did you notice how the floor behind him was like perfectly clean? It was cleaner than it was the day it was put in. That floor was perfectly clean because that's how afraid Martin Luther was of sinning. When he scrubs the floor, he scrubs the floor. Let me tell you, he gets it perfectly right every time because he doesn't want to mess up. But then, as Martin Luther became a monk, he realized that it's even harder to not mess up than he thought it was. Even harder than we've already made it. Because you see, so there's the sins you do, like the time you kicked the cat. That wasn't very good. And then there's the sins you don't do, like when you didn't get the dishes completely clean. So not very good there. But then there's the sins that we don't even know about. Like that time that your friend was waving you on the playground to ask you to come over and play on the swings, but you were playing football with some of your other friends, and you didn't even notice them. And the next day he came up to you and said, I'm mad at you. And you're like, why? What happened? There's all those sins we have no idea we even did. And so Martin Luther's like, this is getting impossible. And so those sins, those are like the germs on your hand. You know how you can't see all those germs? Okay? And so you've got the germ, hold your hands out. So your hands are covered with germs, of course. We can't see them. We only know they're there because science has told us. But in Martin Luther's time, they didn't know they were there. They had no idea we had germs on our hands. They didn't know that we need to clean your hands before you eat to get those germs off. And so now, we can use Purell, but unfortunately for you, you don't know that you have these sins, so I'm sorry you don't get any bottled Purell. This seemed impossible. And for Luther, God felt like the devil. He felt evil for doing all this. And then And then he found out from the Pope, there's these things called indulgences, little pieces of paper, that these little pieces of paper, if you paid for them, you got any money? See, he's not going to get it. If you have money, he don't got money. If you have money, you can pay for these little pieces of paper, and these little pieces of paper say that all this goes away. But you don't have any money, so sorry. and Luther was like, wait. If God can forgive sins anytime, even if we don't confess them all, and if the Pope has the power to forgive all the sins just like that, then why doesn't God forgive sins? God sounds pretty mean. If he can do it, why isn't he doing it? And then Martin Luther opened that verse in Romans that we read today. For we hold that a person is justified, saved, made right, or in other words, all of this is washed off, by grace, as a complete gift, not because we did anything, but because Jesus did something, through faith, by trusting what Christ does. And so, there's a washcloth right there for you. And so, we keep messing up. And we rightly try not to mess up because we want to be in that heaven place, and that's a good thing. And so we try not to mess up as best we can, but we do keep messing up. And we trust God's promise that Christ comes and washes away everything we've done wrong, wipes it all away. So even in the moments we mess up, and even the moments we try to fix what we did wrong, and there's times when we can't fix it all. When we knock the lamp off the table and it shatters into 1,000 pieces, we can't fix it. And God comes and wipes it away and says, it is by my gift, my complete love for you, that you are made clean.